Could a 12-month-old child climb over the high wall of a well on their own, then fall into water that was only knee-deep for an adult, and drown? That was the first question that swirled in the minds of those at the scene, as the body of little Lou in NHI was pulled from the abandoned well behind her grandparents' home. Did the initial explanation of an accidental slip and fall conceal another, far more horrific truth, right within the walls of that seemingly peaceful house? This case is not just a journey to find justice for a tiny soul, but also a painful look at the prejudices, invisible pressures, and dark corners of the human psyche that can lead to irreversible tragedy. The truth, sometimes, hides in the darkest of places, and bringing it to light requires not only persistence but also the courage to face the most terrible things. To not miss the journey of uncovering every complex layer of truth in this case and many other stories, and to join us in spreading profound, cautionary lessons to the community, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. Don't forget to give us a like and a share if you find this content meaningful. Your support is our greatest motivation to continue bringing you true and impactful stories. Dawn in Bin Key Village usually began with the early crowing of roosters and the smoke from kitchen fires drifting from thatched roofs. But on that particular morning, a day that would later be etched into the memory of every villager, it began with a horrifying event. Mr. Tran Duc Min, a man in his 50s, had a habit of waking up early to tend to his small vegetable garden behind his house. That morning, like any other, he carried an old tin bucket, intending to fetch water from the nearby ditch to water his vegetables. The familiar path led him past the property of Lu Vei Kwok, where a well built of laterite stone had been abandoned for many years, its opening overgrown with weeds. As he got closer, a strange, indescribably foul odor assaulted his nostrils. At first, he thought it might be the carcass of some animal that had accidentally fallen in. Ever since the Lu Vei Kwok family got running water, the well had been all but forgotten. Curious, Mr. Duc Min pushed aside the dense weeds obscuring part of the well's opening and squinted down into it. The thick darkness, combined with the increasingly strong smell, sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't see anything clearly, but an ominous feeling crept into his mind. Mr. Duc Min rushed back home to grab a long bamboo pole, then returned to the well. He gently prodded the bottom with the pole. He felt something soft and yielding at the end of it. He carefully hooked it and slowly pulled it up. What he pulled up was not the small animal carcass he had imagined. It was a large cloth bundle, loosely tied, still dripping water. Water dripped from the bundle onto the grass, carrying with it a nauseating smell of death. With incredible courage, or perhaps because he was overwhelmed by shock, Mr. Duc Min used the end of the pole to tremble and nudge the edge of the cloth. And then, the sight within was revealed, causing him to let out a blood-curdling scream, a scream that shattered the morning silence and echoed throughout the hamlet. Inside the cloth bundle was the body of a child. That child was Luin Nhi, the granddaughter of Mrs. Tru Tu Trin, the daughter of Lu Vei Kwok and Vong Tu Han, just 12 months old. Little Nhi's body had already begun to show signs of decomposition. Her skin was pale and bloated. Mr. Duc Min's terrified cry for help quickly attracted the attention of neighbors. People poured out, some with lamps, others with ropes, all heading towards the abandoned well. The scene was chaotic, with the murmurs and whispers of people, and the sound of wailing beginning to rise. When Vong Tu Han, Nhi's mother, was helped to the scene, she only had time to see the small form of her daughter in the cloth bundle before she fainted, her body going limp like a withered banana leaf. The immense pain had struck too suddenly for the young mother to bear. Lu Vei Kwok, Nhi's father, stood frozen as if struck by lightning. His face was ashen, his eyes staring blankly at the cloth bundle. He didn't cry, he didn't scream, only shock and devastation were etched on his features. It seemed Vei Kwok still couldn't believe what was happening before his eyes. His precious little daughter, who was just babbling and laughing yesterday, now lay motionless in such a tragic state. Amidst the chaotic crowd, Mrs. Tru Tu Trin, Nhi's paternal grandmother, appeared with a grief-stricken face. She wept and wailed, her story broken and intermittent. She said that an Nhi often played near the well, and perhaps while playing, the child had accidentally slipped and fallen in. This explanation, amidst the grief and confusion, seemed somewhat plausible. A hyperactive toddler, an abandoned well without a proper barrier. However, few noticed that in Mrs. Tu Trin's tearful words, there was a certain stiffness, a deliberate attempt to steer public opinion. It was a calculated lie, a first attempt to cover up a far more terrible truth. The death of little NHI was not just a tragedy for the Liu family. It was a massive shock to the entire Bin Ki village, a place that had always been peaceful. And from those first moments, suspicions began to creep in. Could a child who was just learning to walk really get so close to such a dangerous well on her own? And if it was an accident, why was the cloth bundle tied up in a seemingly intentional way? These initial questions, though still vague, signaled that a complex and heartbreaking investigation was about to begin. Not long after the news of little Nyi's death spread, the local police force arrived. Leading the investigation team was Detective Trong, a man with a stern appearance and sharp eyes. The area around the abandoned well was quickly cordoned off with tape, preventing curious onlookers from getting too close. The wail of police sirens cut through the mournful atmosphere, but it also brought a faint glimmer of hope that the truth would soon be brought to light. Detective Trong and his team began their work urgently and meticulously. They took initial statements from everyone present, from Mr. Duck Min, the first to discover the body, to the members of the Liu family. Every statement was carefully recorded, even though some contained conflicting details or were colored by emotion. While one group of officers took statements, another conducted a preliminary examination of the scene. The well, as mentioned, was shallow. After Nyi's body was removed, the water level inside was only up to an adult's knee. This immediately raised the first suspicion: if an NHI had fallen in by herself, was there enough water to cause a 12-month-old to drown instantly? Furthermore, the well wall, built of laterite, was quite high, estimated to be nearly a meter. For a child like an NHI, who was just taking her first wobbly steps and could not walk steadily, climbing over such a high wall by herself was almost impossible. The investigators also paid close attention to the clothes on Nyi's body. The clothes were clean, with no signs of mud or scratches, which would be common if a child had fallen or tried to cling to the side while falling into a well. This detail further strengthened the theory that an NHI did not fall on her own. It seemed as though someone had placed her inside the cloth bundle before dropping her into the well. During the process of taking statements, contradictions began to emerge, especially from Mrs. Tru Tu Trin. She adamantly insisted that an NHI frequently played in the area around the well. However, when Detective Trong questioned a few close neighbors, the information he received was completely different. Some said that Mrs. Tu Trin was known for being careful, even strict, in watching over her grandchild. They rarely saw an NHI allowed to play alone in places far from the house, let alone in a dangerous area like the abandoned well. In fact, one person even remembered hearing Mrs. Tu Trin loudly forbid an NHI from wandering far from the yard. Mrs. Tu Trin's statement, when placed alongside the details collected at the scene and information from neighbors, began to reveal inconsistencies. Why would she lie about her granddaughter's playing habits? Was she deliberately trying to steer the investigation in a different direction, one that was favorable to her? Detective Trong noted all these contradictions. He understood that in cases involving family, the truth is often obscured by complex relationships and tangled emotions. He requested the forensic team to collect any possible evidence at the scene, from fingerprints on the well's edge, to any stray fibers, and to thoroughly search the surrounding area for any related evidence. The shallow well, the high wall, the victim's clean clothes, and the contradictions in the grandmother's testimony. All these elements were like scattered puzzle pieces, but they were gradually revealing a different picture, a picture far from the simplicity of a tragic accident. The scene, though silent, was beginning to speak, telling a story that perhaps no one in the Liu family wanted to hear. The investigation had only just begun, but the suspicions were growing thicker, casting a dark shadow over the house already shrouded in grief. After a long fainting spell, Vang Tu Han woke up in the dark, damp room of her husband's family home. The smell of disinfectant from the village clinic, the thick smoke of incense from the main room, and the scent of pain and loss all mingled into a suffocating atmosphere that almost made her choke. The last image she remembered was the small, cold form of an NHI in the cloth bundle. The pain felt like 1,000 needles stabbing her heart, tearing her young soul apart. She wailed, calling her daughter's name in despair. In that moment of desperation, fragmented memories, pieces of her mother-in-law's, Mrs. Tru Tu Trin's, attitude towards an NHI began to surface more clearly than ever. Tu-han recalled the times Mrs. Tu Trin had been cold and openly scowled whenever an NHI cried or refused to eat. She would frequently compare an NHI to the neighbor's sons, making veiled remarks about the family's misfortune in not having a male heir. Tu-han also remembered the faint, suspicious bruises that would occasionally appear on An-Yi's arms and legs. Every time she pressed for an explanation, Mrs. Tu Trin would brush it off, saying the child was clumsy, fell on her own, or that a child's skin bruises easily. At the time, Tu-han, with her submissive nature and respect for her mother-in-law, had tried to believe those explanations, or perhaps she hadn't dared not to believe them. But now, with an NHI gone, those explanations became more suspicious than ever. Lu Wei-kwok, her husband, sat beside her, his face gaunt, his eyes red. He took his wife's hand, trying to offer clumsy words of comfort. But when Tu-han started to sob, questioning him about his mother's attitude, Wei-kwok became flustered and evasive. He was torn between grief for his child and fear of his mother. The pressure from the two most important women in his life left Wei-kwok caught in the middle. He knew his mother could be harsh at times, but he didn't dare to confront her, nor did he want to believe his mother could be involved in his daughter's death. Wei-kwok's silence and avoidance only deepened Tu-han's pain and disappointment. A mournful atmosphere enveloped the small home of the Lu family. Villagers came one after another to offer their condolences. Words of sympathy, sighs of compassion. But among them, Tu-han also caught suspicious glances, whispers that people tried to keep low when they thought she couldn't hear. They talked about the not-so-harmonious relationship between the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law in the Lu family. They mentioned Mrs. Tu Trin's desire for a grandson, a desire that was almost an obsession for many women in this rural area. These whispers were like invisible knives, twisting deeper into Tu-han's wounds. Among the crowd of mourners, one particular appearance drew attention: Tru Ku-fong, Mrs. Tu Trin's brother-in-law, which made him Wei-kwok's uncle. Mr. Ku-fong came to offer condolences with a pained expression, but a perceptive person could detect an undercurrent of gloating, a tone full of hidden meaning in his words. The relationship between the two true siblings had never been good. There was always a silent competition over status and inheritance. The fact that Wei-kwok's family, the main branch, had only one granddaughter, while Mr. Ku-fong's daughter-in-law was rumored to be pregnant and likely with a boy, only deepened the conflict. The presence and words of Mr. Ku-fong were like an invisible pressure, adding fuel to the fire, making the atmosphere in the house even heavier. Tu-han felt alone and helpless. Her daughter had died a terrible death. Her husband was weak, unable to be a firm support. Her mother-in-law was showing more and more suspicious behavior, and she was surrounded by rumors and prying eyes. A mother's grief mingled with indignation and growing suspicion. She knew she couldn't fall apart. She had to find the truth, to demand justice for an NHI, no matter what she had to face. A few days after the tragic death of little An NHI, the preliminary autopsy report was sent to Detective Trong's investigation team. The report, prepared by medical examiner Lee, an expert with many years of experience, revealed crucial information that completely undermined the initial theory of a simple drowning accident. According to the report, the direct cause of An-Yi's death was indeed asphyxiation by drowning. However, what was noteworthy was that before falling into the water, there was a clear sign of a strong external impact on the baby's head. This injury, while not immediately fatal, was strong enough to daze, render unconscious, or at least incapacitate a 12-month-old child. This explained why an NHI could have drowned in such shallow water. But that wasn't all. The autopsy report pointed to an even more horrifying detail. On An-Yi's small body, besides the new head injury, there were numerous old bruises in various stages of healing on her arms, legs, and back. This indicated a prolonged state of possible abuse or, at the very least, rough treatment, not just injuries from being playful or falling, as Mrs. Tu Trin had explained. These old bruises were silent evidence, accusing someone of the past pain little An NHI had endured. The information from the autopsy report immediately shifted the direction of the investigation. If an NHI was struck on the head before entering the water and had prior signs of abuse, this was no longer an accident, but very likely a homicide. The suspicion of Detective Trong and his team now focused on the person who was primarily responsible for An-Yi's care. And that person was none other than Mrs. Tru Tu Trin. She was the one who stayed home to watch the child almost all the time, while Wei Kwok worked far away and Tu Han was busy with farm work or odd jobs to help support the family. A summons was issued for Mrs. Tru Tu Trin to come to the police station for questioning shortly thereafter. Facing Detective Trong, Mrs. Tu Trin initially maintained a calm, even wronged, demeanor. She wept, lamented the loss of her grandchild, and once again insisted that an NHI had accidentally fallen into the well. However, when Detective Trong presented the details from the autopsy report, especially about the head injury and the old bruises, Mrs. Tu Trin's attitude began to shift slightly. When pressed about the bruises, she repeated her old story that an NHI was hyperactive, liked to climb, and that a child's skin bruises easily. She tried to explain that perhaps while playing, an NHI had bumped into something. But these explanations became increasingly forced and unconvincing in the face of scientific evidence. Mrs. Tu Trin's eyes started to show a hint of confusion. She would occasionally glance away, avoiding the investigator's direct gaze. Despite this, she still tried to maintain the facade of a grieving, wrongly accused grandmother. Detective Trong noticed the subtle change in Mrs. Tu Trin's demeanor. He knew that to break through the shell she was trying to create, he needed more solid evidence. The preliminary autopsy report had opened a new path, but the road to the truth was still fraught with obstacles. The old bruises on An's body were not just marks of physical pain, but also indicators of a family tragedy that had been simmering for a long time, with the baby's death being the boiling point. An's death and the growing suspicion surrounding Mrs. Tru Tu Trin deepened the wound in Vong Tu Han's heart. She was no longer the submissive, patient woman she once was. The pain of losing her child had transformed into a force driving her to find the truth. During long, sleepless nights, memories of living under the same roof with her mother-in-law came flooding back, clear and bitter. Tu Han remembered the day she gave birth to an NHI. Her joy of becoming a mother was cut short when she saw the unconcealed disappointment on Mrs. Tu Trin's face. She didn't say it out loud, but her eyes, her sighs, and her indirect comments about having another daughter said it all. Mrs. Tu Trin longed for a grandson to carry on the family line, to solidify the family's standing in the clan, especially since her brother-in-law, Mr. Tru Ku Fong, was always trying to one-up them. The birth of an NHI, a girl, seemed to have shattered all of her expectations. The following months were a series of days where an NHI endured harsh, cold treatment from her own grandmother. Tu Han remembered times Mrs. Tu Trin would deliberately let an NHI cry without comforting her, or feed her leftover, cold porridge. When an NHI started learning to walk, every little fall and scrape was blamed on her being clumsy and useless. Every time Tu Han tried to defend her daughter or care for her too meticulously, she was met with her mother-in-law's scolding and sarcastic remarks, saying she was spoiling the child, that a girl didn't need to be coddled. And Wei Kwok, her husband, and Nyi's father, where was he during all those months? Tu Han recalled the times she tried to confide in her husband about his mother's attitude, but Wei Kwok would usually just remain silent, or advise her to be patient for the sake of peace in the house, that his mother was old and moody and she shouldn't mind. Wei Kwok's silence, his weakness, had inadvertently enabled Mrs. Tu Trin's increasingly outrageous behavior. Now, looking back, Tu Han felt a deep sorrow and anger towards her husband. He had failed to protect their child, and he had failed to protect her. It wasn't just Tu Han. A few neighbors who had previously been hesitant now became braver in providing information to the police. Perhaps it was due to a guilty conscience, or perhaps partly because they had their own simmering conflicts with Mrs. Tu Trin, a woman known for her harshness and nosiness. They recounted hearing Mrs. Tu Trin's scolding voice coming from the Lu house on many occasions. One person even swore they had heard an NHI scream in an unusual way, a cry not of a child's tantrum, but a cry of fear and pain. These testimonies, though small pieces of a puzzle, when put together, painted a terrifying picture of little Nyi's life under her grandmother's care. The conflict within the Lu family escalated. Tu Han no longer stayed silent. She began to question Wei Kwok more intensely about his silence, about his indifference to the warning signs she had pointed out. Wei Kwok felt pressured from all sides, the pain of losing his child, his wife's suspicion, the prying eyes of the villagers, and above all, a vague fear of his own mother. He started drinking more, trying to find solace in alcohol, but the images of an NHI and Tu Han's accusations haunted him relentlessly. The past would not stay buried. It was reawakening, bringing with it pain, regret, and sinful secrets. For Tu Han, revisiting the past was a painful but necessary journey. She knew that the key to unlocking the mystery of An Yi's death might lie somewhere in those seemingly bygone days. And she would not stop until the truth was exposed. Based on the preliminary autopsy results, especially the estimated time of death for little Nhi, Detective Trong and his team began to focus on a specific time frame, the afternoon of the day Nhi was reported missing, before her body was discovered the next morning. This was the period when, according to the initial statements of the family members, Nhi was at home alone with her grandmother, Tru Tu Trin. Tu Han was working in the fields, and Wei Kwok was away at a construction site quite far from home, only returning on weekends or for urgent matters. The investigators began to mentally reconstruct the sequence of events based on the information they had gathered. They pictured a hot afternoon in the small Liu family house. Mrs. Tu Trin was feeding an Nhi. Did something happen during that meal? A moment of frustration? An uncontrolled burst of anger? Was the injury on An Yi's head related to this time frame? Just when the investigation seemed to hit a dead end due to the lack of direct witnesses, a sudden breakthrough occurred. A team was sent to recanvass the households around the Liu family's home, hoping to find any additional information. And they did not return empty-handed. A neighbor's child, a boy named Koa, about 7 or 8 years old, when gently questioned by the police officers, recalled a crucial detail. Koa said that on the afternoon an Nhi went missing, while he was playing in his yard, he heard the sound of something breaking, like a ceramic plate or bowl, coming from Mrs. Tu Trin's house. Immediately after that crash was the sound of little Nhi wailing, a very loud, desperate cry. But the strange thing was, after that piercing cry, everything suddenly went silent. No more crying, and no sounds of comforting or scolding. At the time, Koa didn't pay much attention, as it's common for children to cry and then stop. The testimony of a child might not have been taken seriously by many at first, as children can have vivid imaginations or get things confused. However, in the context of this puzzling case, the detail of the broken dish and An Yi's scream followed by silence, provided by Koa, planted a huge seed of doubt in Detective Trong's mind. It alarmingly matched the theory of an act of violence that might have occurred on that fateful afternoon. With this new information, Detective Trong decided to summon Mrs. Tru Tu Trin for questioning once again. This time, he didn't start with accusatory questions, but began with very small details about that afternoon. How Mrs. Tu Trin was looking after the child, whether an Nhi was well behaved, if she ate properly. Initially, Mrs. Tu Trin stuck to her old story, that an Nhi played nicely and then fell asleep, after which she had to step out for a moment, and when she returned, the child was gone. But when Detective Trong suddenly mentioned the detail of the broken dish and the scream that a young witness had heard, Mrs. Tu Trin's face momentarily changed. She seemed slightly startled but quickly regained her composure. However, faced with sharp questioning and mounting circumstantial evidence, Mrs. Tu Trin began to lose her footing. Finally, after some prevarication, she had to change her statement. Mrs. Tu Trin admitted that on that afternoon, while feeding an Nhi porridge, she had accidentally dropped the porridge dish on the floor. The sound of the breaking dish startled an Nhi, causing her to cry out in fear. Then, according to her, an Nhi cried for a while before calming down and falling asleep. She still adamantly denied hitting or committing any act of violence against her granddaughter. This belated admission, though only a small part of the truth, was a significant step forward. It confirmed that an unusual event had occurred that afternoon, an event that Mrs. Tu Trin had deliberately tried to conceal. Why did she have to lie about dropping the porridge dish? Was it really just a small accident as she claimed? Detective Trong believed that behind this new statement, there was much more that Mrs. Tu Trin was unwilling or afraid to say. That fateful afternoon was certainly not as peaceful as she tried to paint it. After Mrs. Tru Tu Trin's new statement, even though only a part of the truth was revealed, Detective Trong had more reason to believe that something much more serious had happened in the Liu family home on that fateful afternoon. The admission about dropping the porridge dish and An Yi's scream reinforced the suspicion that it was not a random incident. Immediately, an emergency warrant to search the residence of Liu Wei Kwok and Tru Tu Trin was issued. The search took place on a gloomy afternoon, making the atmosphere in the Liu house even heavier. Mrs. Tu Trin sat in a corner, her face showing resignation but her eyes still betraying a restless anxiety. Vong Tu Han, though in pain, tried to remain calm, observing every action of the authorities. She hoped that this search would uncover something, anything, that could help shed light on her daughter's unjust death. The search team split up to go through every nook and cranny of the simple, single-story house. They meticulously checked the kitchen area, where the family usually ate. And, as Detective Trong had anticipated, crucial evidence was found. In the dark, damp wood-fired kitchen, behind a pile of dry firewood, investigators discovered a ceramic dish broken into several pieces, hidden quite well. Upon closer inspection, they noticed the dish had a familiar pattern, similar to other dishes the family regularly used. What was significant was that, despite signs of a hasty cleaning, some of the fragments still had faint stains, suspected to be dried blood. These fragments were immediately seized carefully for DNA testing and to search for other biological traces, like hair or fabric fibers. But it didn't stop there. While checking the bathroom and laundry area, police found some of Nyi's old clothes, rolled up and stuffed into a hidden corner. What was unusual was that on one of the shirts, there were very faint, reddish-brown stains, almost invisible, but they couldn't escape the trained eyes of the investigators. It appeared this shirt had once been bloodstained, and Mrs. Tu Trin had tried to wash it clean, but the traces hadn't completely disappeared. These clothes were also sealed as evidence for the investigation. Lu Wei Kwok, who had just returned from work upon hearing his house was being searched, was stunned when he saw the evidence the police found. He recognized the broken ceramic dish. It was the one his mother often used to feed an Nhi porridge. He also recognized his daughter's old clothes. The combination of these items with his mother's new statement about dropping the porridge dish, along with the suspicious bloodstains, planted a seed of extreme fear and doubt in Wei Kwok's heart. Images of his mother getting angry, even raising her hand to lightly slap an Nhi when the baby cried, moments he had deliberately ignored, now came flooding back with crystal clarity. He had never thought that his own mother, the woman who gave birth to and raised him, could do something so cruel to her own grandchild. But the evidence before his eyes was slowly tearing apart his last weak denial. Wei Kwok completely broke down. He slumped onto the porch, holding his head in his hands, unable to speak. The pain of losing his child now mingled with the horror of facing the possibility that the mother he feared and respected was the perpetrator. The relationship between Wei Kwok and Tu Han, already fractured after Nyi's death, now deteriorated even further. Tu Han looked at her husband with eyes full of disappointment and rage. Wei Kwok's weakness, his silence in the face of his mother's actions, now seemed like complicity in Tu Han's eyes. She said nothing, but that look was enough to make Wei Kwok feel guilty and ashamed. The evidence collected at the Lu house, especially the broken dish and bloodstained clothes, became irrefutable proof, strengthening the theory of a homicide. They not only pointed to the possible act of violence but also showed a deliberate effort by Mrs. Tu Trin to conceal her crime. The investigation was making great strides, and the veil of secrecy shrouding Nyi's death was slowly being lifted. With the physical evidence collected and Mrs. Tu Trin's increasingly contradictory statements, Detective Trong determined that, in addition to clarifying the criminal act, finding her motive was crucial. Such a cruel act against her own granddaughter must have stemmed from a deeper cause, not just a momentary loss of control. The investigation team began to delve deeper into the family and clan relationships of Mrs. Tu Trin. They paid special attention to the relationship between Mrs. Tu Trin and her brother-in-law, Mr. Tru Ku Fong. Through the accounts of neighbors and some distant relatives, a picture of a silent rivalry and long-simmering conflicts between the two family branches gradually emerged. Mr. Ku Fong, the younger brother of Mrs. Tu Trin's late husband, was a somewhat cunning man who always wanted to appear more important in the clan. Although the family of Wei Kwok, Mrs. Tu Trin's son, belonged to the main branch, the fact that Wei Kwok only had a daughter, an Nhi, while Mr. Ku Fong's son had just married and his daughter-in-law was rumored to be pregnant, likely with a boy, gave Mr. Ku Fong an advantage. He frequently made veiled remarks, sometimes directly, sometimes through others, about the family having no heir, using proverbs that implied Wei Kwok's family was inadequate for not producing a son. This pressure became even heavier when it came to property. The Lu clan had a small piece of ancestral land, which, while not very valuable economically, held great spiritual and traditional significance for the family members. There was also a small savings account left by the grandparents, which, according to village custom, would usually be prioritized for the branch with a direct male heir to handle ancestral worship in the future. Having a grandson would significantly strengthen the position of Wei Kwok's family branch in the silent dispute over this land and money, and it would also be a victory of honor over his uncle, Ku Feng. Mrs. Tu Trin, a widowed woman who had worked hard her whole life and was deeply ingrained with the patriarchal ideology of valuing boys over girls, felt immense pressure on her shoulders. The birth of an NHI, a girl, not only failed to bring her joy but made her feel disappointed, even resentful. In her eyes, an NHI was not just a burden but also a symbol of her family's inferiority compared to Mr. Ku Feng's. Every taunt, every disdainful look from her brother-in-law and others felt like a knife twisting in her pride and sense of face. Detective Trong, in subsequent sessions with Mrs. Tu Trin, skillfully brought up these pressures. He talked about the village rumors, the clan rivalry, the desire to have a grandson to hold her head high. Initially, Mrs. Tu Trin vehemently denied it, claiming it was all slander and fabrication. However, when Detective Trong presented evidence of her frequent expressions of dissatisfaction after Nyi's birth and the harsh words she used with her granddaughter, Mrs. Tu Trin started to become more agitated. She could no longer maintain her calm, wronged facade. Her eyes flashed with pent-up anger and resentment. She began to lament her hardships, about shouldering the family's burdens alone, about the harsh words she had to endure from others, from her own relatives. Although she didn't directly confess, through her frustrated words, it was clear that an NHI being a girl made Mrs. Tu Trin feel disadvantaged, cornered in the silent war for status and property against Mr. Ku Feng's family. The motive was slowly becoming clear. It wasn't just hatred for a child, but the desperation, selfishness, and flawed calculations of a woman obsessed with antiquated ideas and clan pressure. An NHI, a tiny, innocent soul, had unwittingly become an obstacle, a victim of the conflicts and ambitions of adults. This truth made the case even more heartbreaking and tragic. In the days filled with grief and the struggle to find the truth about her daughter's death, Vong Tu Han not only faced a brutal present but also stumbled upon fragments of her husband Lu Wei Kwok's past. These fragments revealed another side of Mrs. Tu Trin's tyranny and partly explained Wei Kwok's incomprehensible weakness. One afternoon, while cleaning up old belongings in the house, Tu Han chanced upon a small wooden box, tucked away at the bottom of a chest. Inside were a few yellowed letters and a photograph of a young woman with delicate features and sad eyes. The woman in the photo was not Tu Han. A wife's intuition told her this might be a part of Wei Kwok's past that he had never told her about. After many restless nights, Tu Han decided to confront her husband directly. At first, Wei Kwok was evasive and annoyed. But faced with his wife's persistence and questioning gaze, he finally opened up. The girl in the photo was named Li Mong Dao, Wei Kwok's first deep love. They had been deeply in love as youngsters and had planned to spend their lives together. But their relationship was vehemently opposed by Mrs. Tu Trin. Through Wei Kwok's broken, sorrowful account, and later, through some veiled hints from a distant relative that Tu Han painstakingly sought out, the portrait of Mrs. Tu Trin became clearer than ever. A harsh, conservative woman who would do anything to control her son's life according to her will. Mrs. Tu Trin looked down on Li Mong Dao's family for being poor, not a suitable match for her own, even though the Lu family was hardly well off themselves. She believed Mong Dao was not virtuous enough to be her daughter-in-law, that she couldn't help Wei Kwok achieve success and honor. Mrs. Tu Trin used every trick in the book to separate Wei Kwok and Mong Dao. She pressured and berated Wei Kwok daily. She went to Mong Dao's house to make things difficult, saying hurtful things to her family. Some even said that Mrs. Tu Trin fabricated stories to slander Mong Dao's reputation, causing the young woman great shame. Faced with his mother's fierce opposition and schemes, Wei Kwok, who was naturally gentle and somewhat weak, was not strong enough to protect his love. In the end, that beautiful first love ended in tears and regret. Li Mong Dao later left the village, carrying a deep emotional wound. It was said that she started a new life elsewhere, but her existence, even just in the past, remained like an invisible thorn in Mrs. Tu Trin's side and, at times, a vague obsession for Tu Han. The story of Li Mong Dao not only deepened the simmering conflict between Tu Han and Wei Kwok, as Tu Han felt her husband was too weak, not just with his mother but also with his past. More importantly, it further etched the tyrannical, patriarchal character of Mrs. Tu Trin, who was willing to cruelly interfere in her children's lives. This helped to further explain Wei Kwok's fear and almost absolute submission to his mother. He had been dominated by his mother once before, deprived of his personal happiness, and that emotional wound had probably never truly healed. Wei Kwok's weakness was not just his nature, but the result of a long process of being controlled and oppressed. The ghost of the past, with the story of Li Mong Dao, served as a warning, a premonition of Nyu's tragedy. If Mrs. Tu Trin could cruelly break up her son's love just because of her own prejudices and selfishness, what would she be capable of when the birth of an Nhi, a girl, went against her wishes and calculations in the clan's power struggle? The past was not at rest, it was providing more crucial pieces to complete the complex psychological portrait of the woman named Tru Tu Trin, who now stood before the court of conscience and law. Under the pressure of irrefutable evidence, the broken ceramic dish found hidden in the kitchen, the faint bloodstains on Nyu's old clothes, along with witness testimonies and the logical analysis of the investigators, Mrs. Tru Tu Trin's wall of defense began to crumble. She could no longer play the part of a grieving, wrongly accused grandmother. During a tense interrogation that lasted for hours, faced with the physical evidence laid out right in front of her, Mrs. Tu Trin finally bowed her head, admitting to a part of her sinful act. Tears streamed down her weathered face as she sobbed and recounted that on that fateful afternoon, she had hit little an Nhi. According to this new testimony, an Nhi was fussy and refused to eat her porridge that day. Mrs. Tu Trin, already agitated by family and clan pressures, combined with the fatigue of daily childcare, couldn't control her anger. She claimed it was an accident, that because an Nhi wouldn't stop crying and even knocked over the bowl of porridge, she lost her temper and gave an Nhi a light push, causing her to fall. She claimed Nyu's head hit the edge of a table or a wall, and then the baby went limp. It was a confession, but only half the truth. Mrs. Tu Trin tried to downplay the severity of her actions, describing it as an unintentional accident, a slip of the hand in a moment of anger. She wept, expressing remorse, saying she never wanted to harm her own granddaughter. Following that, Mrs. Tu Trin described her initial plan to cover up the crime. After seeing an Nhi fall and go limp, she panicked. She hastily gave an Nhi a quick wash and changed her into a clean set of clothes. She also quickly cleaned up the scene, gathering the broken pieces of the dish, wiping away the spilled porridge and, perhaps, the bloodstains she refused to admit were there. She claimed that she initially intended to take an Nhi to the village clinic, but when she tried to wake her and found no response, no breath, she became terrified. The fear of being discovered, of going to prison, of the villagers' gossip, overwhelmed everything else. It was then that the idea of staging a fake scene, an accident where an Nhi fell into the well, formed in her mind. This testimony, while admitting to causing injury to an Nhi and concealing it, still had many points that made Detective Trong and his team suspicious. First, according to the autopsy report, the wound on Nyu's head was caused by a strong impact, unlikely to be from just a light push and a fall as Mrs. Tu Trin described. Second, the act of bathing an Nhi, changing her clothes, and systematically cleaning the scene showed a calculated, clear intention to destroy evidence, not just the actions of someone in a panic. Mrs. Tu Trin was trying to evade a more serious charge, attempting to turn what could have been intentional assault leading to death into a case of negligent homicide. She hoped that a partial confession, combined with her old age and belated tears, might earn her leniency from the law. However, Detective Trong was not easily convinced. He knew that this confession still hid many unspoken truths. Why did she have to hit an Nhi so hard? And did the events following Nyu's fall really happen as she described? Tru Tu Trin's partial confession was a step forward, but it was not the end of the investigation. There were still important pieces of the puzzle to be found to reconstruct the full picture of that fateful afternoon. Although Tru Tu Trin had admitted to part of her actions, the inconsistencies in her statement, especially regarding the force of the blow and the subsequent events, still made Detective Trong feel that something was off. Her claim of throwing Nyu's body into the well in the evening to stage an accident needed to be more thoroughly verified. Therefore, a more careful and meticulous re-examination of the scene around the abandoned well was conducted. This time, the investigators didn't just focus on the inside or the mouth of the well, but expanded their search area to the surroundings, paying attention to every crack in the rocks and every bush. and their persistence paid off. In a small, well-hidden crevice near the well's opening, a place that would be very difficult to spot without careful observation, an investigator found a small, old piece of cloth. The cloth was indigo blue, faded, and seemed to have been torn from something, possibly a handkerchief or a piece of old clothing. What was noteworthy was the position where the cloth was stuck. It was in a narrow crack, a place where it was unlikely to have been blown by the wind and gotten stuck by chance, but rather seemed to have been wedged there by some action. This small piece of cloth was immediately seized and sent to the forensics lab. At the same time, Detective Trong had someone take a photo of the cloth to Vong Tu Han, hoping she might recognize it. After a careful look, Tu Han was suddenly stunned. She recognized that piece of cloth. It was part of an old handkerchief that her mother-in-law, Mrs. Tru Tu Trin, often used to wipe her sweat or to tie up small items when she went to the fields. Mrs. Tu Trin had used this handkerchief for a very long time. It had a few small tears and a distinctive color that Tu Han could not mistake. Sometimes, Tu Han had even seen Mrs. Tu Trin use it to wipe An Yi's mouth after she ate. The discovery of the piece of Mrs. Tu Trin's handkerchief stuck near the well became an incredibly important piece of the puzzle, a seemingly small detail that had the potential to overturn part of her testimony. In her partial confession, Mrs. Tu Trin claimed that after an NHI died, she waited until dusk, when it was getting dark and there were few people around, to sneakily take An Yi's body to the well to dispose of it. However, this piece of cloth, if it truly belonged to Mrs. Tu Trin and had been dropped during the act of disposing of the body, its location suggested a different scenario. Such a small piece of cloth, if dropped at night in a hurry and panic, would be very unlikely to be blown by the wind or accidentally get stuck in such a hidden crevice. It was more likely that it was dropped and got stuck during the day, when there was enough light and there might have been some activity around the well area. This raised the suspicion that Mrs. Tu Trin might not have gone to the well just once in the evening as she claimed. Or, the time she disposed of the body might have been different from what she said. Could it be that she had gone to the well area multiple times to prepare, to scout, or even acted at an earlier time, possibly right after An Yi's death in the afternoon or early evening? This contradiction, though not directly proving murder, showed a lack of honesty and a more thorough attempt to conceal the crime on Mrs. Tu Trin's part. She wasn't just lying about the level of violence, but she might have also lied about the timing and the process of disposing of the body. The old handkerchief, an ordinary everyday item, had now become a silent witness, exposing more of the killer's lies. It was like a final piece of the puzzle, helping to complete the picture of Tru Tu Trin's cruelty and sophisticated schemes. With this new evidence, Detective Trong was even more convinced that the full and true confession had not yet been told. With the handkerchief found near the well, a seemingly small piece of evidence that carried a heavy weight of accusation, Detective Trong decided it was the right time for a final showdown with Tru Tu Trin. He understood that to completely shatter the wall of lies she had painstakingly built, he needed a full-scale assault, combining sharp evidence with powerful psychological tactics. In the interrogation room, the air grew thicker than ever. Detective Trong no longer maintained the gentle demeanor of previous sessions. He laid out all the collected evidence on the table: the detailed autopsy report on An Yi's head wound, photos of the old bruises on the baby's body, the fragments of the blood-stained ceramic dish, An Yi's clothes with suspicious stains, and finally, the piece of cloth from Mrs. Tu Trin's own handkerchief, found near the well. Detective Trong began to logically and clearly recount the entire sequence of the crime, based on the evidence. He pointed out the absurdity of Mrs. Tu Trin's claim that an NHI fell into the well on her own, because a 12-month-old child could not climb over such a high wall, and the baby's clothes showed no signs of such a fall. He emphasized the medical examiner's conclusion about the strong force that caused the head injury, which did not match her explanation of a light push. Next, Detective Trong meticulously analyzed Mrs. Tu Trin's actions to conceal the crime: bathing and changing An Yi's clothes, cleaning the scene, hiding the broken dish, and especially, fabricating the story of an NHI going missing and falling into the well. All these actions showed a calculated, clear intention to evade punishment, not the panicked actions of someone who had made a mistake. The piece of handkerchief was presented as the decisive blow. Detective Trong relentlessly questioned the contradiction between Mrs. Tu Trin's statement about the time of disposing of the body and the fact that the handkerchief was likely dropped during the day. He pressed her on how many times she had gone to the well and what she was doing there during the day, before nightfall as she had claimed. The barrage of questions, coupled with the irrefutable evidence, began to make Mrs. Tu Trin flustered. But Detective Trong's attack didn't stop at logic and evidence. He began to use powerful psychological tactics. He spoke of the sacred bond of motherhood, the innocence and pitiful state of little Nhi, a tiny soul who had suffered so much before she died. He talked about the heart-wrenching pain of Vong Tu Han, the mother who had lost her only child. He also didn't forget to mention the torment and guilt of Lu Wei Kwok, the son Mrs. Tu Trin always claimed to love, who was now living in shame and misery because of his mother's actions. Detective Trong even skillfully brought up the image of Tru Ku Fong, the brother-in-law Mrs. Tu Trin always saw as a rival. He described how Mr. Ku Fong might be gloating to see Mrs. Tu Trin's family in ruins, to see her entangled with the law. This directly struck Mrs. Tu Trin's deep-seated pride and sense of face. Faced with this relentless assault on both her reason and emotions, Tru Tu Trin's feigned composure began to violently shake. Her face turned pale, her lips moved but no words came out. The images of an Nhi, her piercing cry, the moment of guilt she had tried to bury, now replayed in her mind like a slow-motion film, haunting her. The fear of legal punishment, the torment of her conscience, and perhaps, a flicker of belated remorse, all combined, leaving Mrs. Tu Trin with no strength to resist. She clutched her head and began to sob, no longer the feigned, wronged tears from before, but the cries of desperation, of collapse. The final wall of lies had been broken. Tru Tu Trin began to truly panic, muttering incoherently, her words no longer making sense, but it was clear she was about to break. The tears of truth, though late, were about to fall. After hours of intense psychological battle and a complete mental breakdown, Tru Tu Trin no longer had the strength to hide her crime. Faced with irrefutable evidence and the weight of her conscience, she finally began to recount the full, horrifying truth of that fateful afternoon, the day she took the life of her own granddaughter, little Lu in Nhi. Belated tears streamed down her old, weathered face, but they could never wash away the monstrous sin she had committed. According to Tru Tu Trin's more detailed and complete confession, on that afternoon, just like any other, she was at home watching an Nhi. Wei Kwok was working far away, and Tu Han was busy in the fields. Mrs. Tu Trin cooked a thin porridge for an Nhi to eat. However, for some reason, an Nhi was fussy that day and refused to eat. She kept her mouth shut tight, shook her head vigorously, and even used her hand to push away the spoon of porridge Mrs. Tu Trin tried to feed her. The frustration that had been simmering inside Mrs. Tu Trin for a long time finally erupted. The pressure to have a grandson to carry on the family line and to outdo Mr. Ku Fong's family, the disappointment that an Nhi was a girl, the weariness of old age, and the burden of single-handedly caring for a child who wasn't always well behaved. All these were like small, smoldering flames. And Nyi's crying and refusal to eat that day acted as a spark, igniting an uncontrollable rage within the woman. Mrs. Tu Trin began to yell at an Nhi. Her shouts grew louder, harsher. But an Nhi, perhaps out of fear or discomfort, only cried louder, a piercing, mournful wail. Mrs. Tu Trin's anger was fueled even more. She felt helpless, felt that the existence of this granddaughter was a burden, a mockery of her own desires and ambitions. And then, in a moment of complete irrationality, a cruel act occurred. Mrs. Tu Trin, who was holding the ceramic dish with the rest of Nyi's porridge, lost all composure. Instead of trying to soothe her grandchild or find another way to feed her, she did something unimaginable. In a fit of extreme rage, she used that very porridge dish to strike an Nhi hard on the head. A sickening, dry thud echoed. The ceramic dish shattered into pieces, porridge splattering everywhere. And an Nhi, after that thud, only had time to let out one final, piercing scream before going completely limp. Her small body went soft, collapsing onto the floor. Immediately after that act, Mrs. Tu Trin's anger seemed to vanish, replaced by an overwhelming fear. She looked at her granddaughter lying motionless on the floor, next to the broken pieces of the dish and the thin porridge seeping into the dirt floor. She panicked, rushing to shake an Nhi, trying to wake her up, but it was useless. She was met with a terrifying silence. Nyi's eyes were closed, her face pale. Trembling, Mrs. Tu Trin placed a hand on Nyi's nose, trying to feel for breath. But there was nothing. Nyi's skin began to grow cold. The initial fear quickly turned into horror. What had she done? Had she killed her own granddaughter? The thought hit her like a sledgehammer, making her dizzy, unable to stand steady. Tru Tu Trin's confession, though late, revealed the first part of the tragedy, an act that erupted from a fit of rage but stemmed from long-held repressions, prejudices, and pressures. It wasn't a light push as she had claimed before, but a fatal blow, a brutal act of violence against a 12-month-old child. And that was only the beginning of a series of even more horrific acts to cover up the crime. After the horrifying realization that she might have killed her own granddaughter, Tru Tu Trin lost all sense of reason. An overwhelming fear consumed her mind. Fear of being discovered, fear of facing legal punishment, fear of the villagers' scorn, and perhaps, fear of her own conscience, even if it was clouded at that moment. In her panic, the instinct for self-preservation rose fiercely. Mrs. Tu Trin didn't think about calling for help, didn't think about taking an NHI to the hospital with the faint hope that she could still be saved. Instead, the first and only thought that flashed through her mind was that she had to hide the crime, to erase all traces. She hastily picked up an NHI and carried her to the bathroom. She used cold water to quickly rinse the lifeless body, trying to wash away the porridge and any blood that might be on the baby. Then, she found a clean set of clothes and changed an NHI. This act, though performed with trembling haste, showed a certain calculation. She wanted to make an NHI look as if nothing unusual had happened. Next, Mrs. Tu Trin returned to the original scene, where the ceramic dish was broken. She carefully collected every single fragment, trying not to miss any. She used a rag to wipe away the porridge and the bloodstains she wouldn't admit were blood, which were splattered on the floor. Everything was done quickly, but also meticulously. She didn't want to leave behind any trace that could incriminate her. The broken dish fragments were then wrapped up and hidden carefully in the wood-fired kitchen, hoping no one would find them. After cleaning up the scene, Mrs. Tu Trin placed Nyi's body on her small bed, covered her with a blanket, trying to create the appearance that an NHI was sleeping peacefully. She sat there, looking at her motionless granddaughter, her heart a whirlwind of emotions, fear, a fleeting sense of remorse, but above all, the anxiety of being discovered. She waited in vain. She hoped that an NHI had only fainted, that she would wake up after a while. She just sat there, occasionally shaking an NHI, pressing her ear to the baby's chest to listen. But time ticked by, an hour, then two. Nyi's body grew colder, with no warmth left. Any hope, however faint, gradually faded. Mrs. Tu Trin knew that an NHI was truly dead. Dead at her own hands. When this brutal truth became undeniable, the fear in Tru Tu Trin's heart intensified. She couldn't let anyone know about this. She couldn't go to prison. She had to do something to get away with it. And then, a more cruel and wicked plan formed in the woman's mind. She decided to dispose of Nyi's body, to create a fake scene, a drowning accident. The abandoned well behind the house, a place few people passed by, became her chosen location. Mrs. Tu Trin waited until dusk, when the villagers had returned home to rest and the roads were empty. She took an old cloth, wrapped Nyi's body in it, and stealthily carried it out the back of the house, towards the abandoned well. In the dim twilight, she dropped the bundle containing her granddaughter's body into the shallow well. Then, she returned home, trying to maintain a calm demeanor, preparing for her next act, the performance of a grieving, heartbroken grandmother who had lost her grandchild. Tru Tu Trin's full confession laid bare the raw and brutal truth of the case. From a sudden outburst of anger leading to a fatal act of violence, to the calculated efforts to conceal the crime, it all showed the extreme moral decay of a person dominated by negative prejudices and pressures. Nyi's tears, perhaps, were not just for the physical pain, but also for the betrayal, the cruelty from the very person who should have loved and protected her. The truth about little Nyi's death, exposed through the full and horrifying confession of Tru Tu Trin, dealt a fatal blow to the Liu family. Pain, shock, rage, and disgust intertwined, creating an atmosphere of grief and heaviness more intense than ever. After Tru Tu Trin was officially arrested and the full details of the crime were communicated to the family by the police, Vong Tu Han requested, or perhaps was granted permission by the authorities, to meet her mother-in-law one last time. The meeting took place in the visiting room of the police station, separated by a thick glass panel. Tu Han looked at the woman who was once her mother-in-law, who had lived under the same roof, and who was also the person who had mercilessly taken her daughter's life. The pain in Tu Han's heart was no longer one of weak sorrow, but had transformed into an overwhelming rage, a burning fire of resentment. With a hoarse voice and unending tears, Tu Han screamed heart-wrenching questions, demanding to know why Tu Trin could be so cruel to an Nhi, her own innocent grandchild. What crime had she committed to deserve such a tragic end? The cries of the bereaved mother echoed like knives in the silent room. Tu Trin sat opposite, her face old and gaunt, devoid of its usual harshness or calculation, leaving only exhaustion, bewilderment, and perhaps a touch of fear. She didn't dare to look her daughter-in-law in the eye, only bowing her head in silence. Her silence only fueled Tu Han's fury. The brief meeting ended in sobs and curses from the young mother. For Lu Wei Kwok, this truth was an unbearable shock. He completely collapsed, both physically and mentally. The mother he both respected and feared, the one he never dared to disobey, was the murderer of his daughter. This was beyond Wei Kwok's imagination and endurance. He couldn't believe it, didn't want to believe it, but the evidence and his own mother's confession were too clear. Remorse tormented Wei Kwok. He regretted being so weak, for not daring to stand up and protect his wife and child from his mother's harshness. He regretted ignoring the unusual signs and Tu Han's warnings so many times. He regretted letting the tragedy happen right inside his own home. Now, Wei Kwok was not only pained by the loss of his child, but also felt an indescribable disgust and shame for his mother's actions. He didn't know how to face Tu Han, how to face the villagers, how to face himself. The image of his mother in Wei Kwok's mind had completely shattered, replaced by the image of a cold-blooded killer. As for Tru Ku Fong, Mrs. Tu Trin's brother-in-law, upon hearing that his sister-in-law was the culprit, he couldn't hide his satisfaction, though he tried to feign sympathy on the surface. He commented that he never would have thought she could do such a terrible thing, that a woman's heart is truly unpredictable. Mr. Ku Fong's veiled words were like rubbing salt in the wounds of Wei Kwok's family. For him, this was probably a victory in the silent war for status and property in the clan. The main branch of the family was in ruins, their reputation destroyed. What could now stand in the way of his family's position? The people of Bin Ki village, after days of gossip and speculation, were now shocked and outraged upon learning the truth. No one could have imagined that a grandmother could be so cruel to her own grandchild just because of antiquated prejudices and family conflicts. The case became a hot topic, a haunting story in all their conversations. Sympathy for little Nhi and Vong Tu Han grew, along with a strong condemnation of Tru Trin's inhumane actions. The exposed truth left unhealable wounds in the Lu family. The pain, loss, betrayal, and emotional rifts would haunt them for a long time. For Tu Han and Wei Kwok, the future was a blurry void, full of unanswered questions. The death of an Nhi and the horrifying truth behind it was not just a criminal case that was solved, but it left deep and indelible psychological scars on the lives of those left behind, especially Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok. The heavy, gloomy atmosphere not only enveloped the Lu family but also spread throughout Bin Ki village, like a painful reminder of the tragedies that can happen when outdated ideologies and domestic violence are not stopped. For Vong Tu Han, the shock of losing her child and the betrayal from her own mother-in-law changed her profoundly. From a submissive, patient woman, she became stronger and more decisive. She was the one who relentlessly sought the truth, who faced the pressures and pain to demand justice for an Nhi. After Tru Trin was arrested, Tu Han no longer wept sorrowfully. The pain was still there, simmering and aching, but it had been transformed into inner strength. She knew she had to live on, not just for herself, but also so that Nyi's death would not be in vain. However, the emotional wound from losing a child was immense, and it would follow her for the rest of her life. Every time she saw a child around Nyi's age, every time she heard the laughter of children, her heart felt like it was being squeezed. Her relationship with Wei Kwok also faced a great test. Could she forgive her husband's weakness? Could they overcome this tragedy together, or would it lead to an irreparable breakdown? These were questions that only time could answer. Lu Wei Kwok, in contrast to his wife, sank deep into torment and guilt. He couldn't forgive his mother, but he also couldn't forgive himself. He blamed himself for being too cowardly, for failing to protect his daughter, for letting the tragedy happen under his own roof. Belated remorse tormented Wei Kwok even in his sleep. He started turning to alcohol as a way to escape reality, but the more he drank, the more sober he felt. The more he remembered an NHI, the more guilty he felt. At times, Wei Kwok became depressed, withdrawn, and avoided everyone. He was afraid to face Tu Han's gaze, afraid to hear the villagers' whispers. The psychological scar in Wei Kwok was perhaps even deeper than Tu Han's, because it was not just the pain of loss but also shame, helplessness, and the feeling that he was partly responsible for the tragedy. The atmosphere in Bin Ki village also changed. The case of Little and NHI had become a hard-to-wash-away stain, a painful lesson that people repeated over and over. It was not just a story about a murder case, but a warning about the horrific consequences of the patriarchal ideology of valuing boys over girls that still persists in many rural areas. People began to re-examine family conflicts, the invisible pressures that women and girls have to endure. A news story made many reflect on the responsibility of each individual to protect children, to speak out against domestic violence and outdated, backward customs. The psychological scars left by the case will never completely disappear. They will smolder in the memories of those involved, in the consciousness of the entire community. Tu Han's pain, Wei Kwok's torment, and the villagers' horror at Tru Tu Trin's actions will all be constant reminders of a tragedy that might not have happened if there had been love, empathy, and the courage to confront and change. Bin Ki village, after this case, would probably never be as peaceful as it once was. After Tru Tu Trin fully confessed and admitted to all her criminal acts, the work of the investigative agency was not yet over. To ensure the case file was tight and convincing when brought to trial, Detective Trong and his colleagues proceeded to gather more corroborating evidence, completing the necessary documents according to legal procedures. One of the important tasks was to continue recording and systematizing the testimonies of witnesses. Not only those directly involved like Vong Tu Han, Lu Wei Kwok, or the neighbors who provided initial information, but also others in the village who had contact with or knew about Mrs. Tu Trin's relationship and attitude towards Little and NHI before the crime occurred, were also invited for interviews. These testimonies, though they might not be directly related to the act of murder, helped to further clarify the motive, the psychology of the defendant, and the complex family context that led to the tragedy. They painted a fuller picture of the harshness, prejudices, and pressures Mrs. Tu Trin faced, as well as how she vented those negativities onto her innocent granddaughter. In addition, the detailed forensic examination report on Little and Yu's body was completed and added to the file. This report not only confirmed the cause of death as drowning after a strong external impact to the head, but also described in more detail the nature and extent of the injury, and estimated the force required to cause such damage. This information further refuted Mrs. Tu Trin's initial claim of only lightly pushing an NHI, and confirmed the violent, cruel nature of the criminal act. The time of death was also determined more precisely, helping to corroborate the sequence of events that Mrs. Tu Trin had confessed to. In some necessary cases according to investigative procedures, especially for serious and complex cases like this one, the investigative agency may conduct a crime scene reenactment. Mrs. Tru Tu Trin, under the strict supervision of the police and representatives from the prosecutor's office, was required to reenact her entire criminal act, from the moment of conflict with an NHI, the act of hitting the baby, to the process of erasing evidence and disposing of the body. Every action, every detail was filmed, photographed, and carefully documented in a report. The crime scene reenactment not only helped to verify the defendant's testimony but also gave the legal authorities a more direct and clear view of the case's progression, thereby helping them to make accurate judgments and decisions. All documents, from the statements of the defendant and witnesses, forensic reports, scene examination reports, investigation reenactments, to the collected physical evidence, were compiled and organized scientifically and logically in the case file. Every detail was carefully checked and cross-referenced to ensure its authenticity and a tight connection to each other. Finally, after a period of urgent and serious work, the police investigation agency completed the case file. Based on all the evidence and documents collected, the investigative agency concluded, Tru Tu Trin, due to family conflicts, pressure to have a male heir, and personal prejudices, intentionally used a ceramic dish to strike her 12-month-old granddaughter, Luan NHI, on the head, causing serious injury. After seeing an NHI die, Tru Tu Trin took actions to erase evidence and dispose of the body by throwing it into an abandoned well to create a fake scene. Tru Tu Trin's actions constituted the crime of intentional murder as defined by the criminal law. The investigation agency issued a decision to recommend that the People's Procuracy of the same level prosecute Tru Tu Trin before the court for the aforementioned crime. The case file, hundreds of pages long, containing the entire painful truth about the death of little Nhi, was ready to be transferred to the next stage of the legal process, trial and judgment. Justice, though delayed, was drawing very near. After the case file was transferred to the prosecutor's office and the indictment was issued, the day Tru Tu Trin had to face the court's judgment drew closer. This waiting period was a heavy time for everyone involved, each with their own feelings and concerns. In the detention center, Tru Tu Trin lived her days in solitude and fear. No more schemes, no more lies. She was now just an old, guilty woman awaiting punishment. The four cold walls of the cell seemed to amplify the emptiness and despair in her heart. At night, nightmares frequently came, images of little Nhi with her screams, with eyes looking at her full of reproach, haunting her mind relentlessly. Perhaps, in these moments, a little late remorse had crept into Tru Tu Trin's hardened soul. But that remorse was likely more a result of fear of the impending punishment than genuine repentance for the crime she had committed. She didn't know what future awaited her, only that it would be a dark and inescapable one. For Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok, preparing for the trial as the victim's family once again deepened their never-fading pain. They had to reread the case documents, prepare themselves mentally to face the killer, who was once their mother and grandmother, at the public trial. Every detail, every image of Nyi's death that was recalled was like a knife twisting in their hearts. Tu Han, though stronger, still couldn't avoid moments of weakness, her tears falling again when she thought of her little daughter. Wei Kwok became more and more withdrawn and quiet. He was afraid to face his mother in court, afraid to hear the accusations again, afraid to see the collapse of the woman who gave birth to him, no matter how guilty she was. Both Tu Han and Wei Kwok hoped for a just and fair sentence from the court, so that Nyi's soul could find peace, and so they could find a little bit of peace, however fragile, after the storm. Meanwhile, the case of little Nhi had caused a stir not only in Bin Ki village but also in the surrounding areas. The story of the cruel grandmother who killed her granddaughter because of patriarchal views and family conflicts became a topic of conversation everywhere. Public opinion strongly condemned Tru Tu Trin's cruel and inhumane actions. At the same time, the case also sparked debates about the responsibility of family and community in protecting children, and the need to eliminate outdated customs and gender prejudices that are deeply rooted in many people's minds. There were opinions expressing deep sympathy for the victim's family, especially the young mother, Vong Tu Han. There were also calls for the harshest sentence for the killer, to set an example for society. The atmosphere before the judgment day became tense and heavy. All eyes were on the courthouse, where justice was about to be served. Tru Tu Trin's fate would be decided. And no matter the outcome, this case had already left a very expensive lesson, a profound warning for everyone. The day of judgment was not just a day for Tru Tu Trin, but also a day for society to reflect on its moral values, responsibilities, and its own shortcomings. The day of Tru Tu Trin's trial for intentional murder finally arrived. The atmosphere in the district people's courtroom was extremely tense and crowded. Besides those with rights and obligations, like Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok, a large number of people from Bin Ki village and neighboring areas came to attend and follow the proceedings. They wanted to witness the perpetrator face the punishment of the law with their own eyes, and also to find a final answer to the mysteries and sorrows the case had caused. Tru Tu Trin was led into the courtroom, looking much more haggard and older than before. Her eyes were sunken, her face vacant, as she took heavy, slow steps. When she saw Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok in the front row for the victim's family, her eyes flickered for a moment, then she quickly looked down, not daring to look at them directly. The trial began with the presiding judge reading the decision to bring the case to trial. Then, the representative of the People's Procuracy, acting as the public prosecutor, solemnly read the indictment. Every word, every sentence in the indictment fell like a hammer blow in the silent courtroom. The entire criminal act of Tru Tu Trin, from the deep-seated motive of patriarchal ideology and clan pressure, to the act of using a ceramic dish to strike little Nhi on the head, and then the schemes to conceal and dispose of the body, were all presented clearly and coherently, based on the irrefutable evidence collected during the investigation. Next was the examination phase. The trial panel asked many questions to the defendant, Tru Tu Trin, as well as to the witnesses and related parties. Mrs. Tu Trin, before the court's questions, mostly bowed her head and admitted to her criminal acts as she had confessed to the investigative agency. Her voice trembled, broken, without the evasiveness and denial of the early days. However, when asked about her deep-seated motive, she still tried to partially blame her circumstances, the pressures she had to endure. The defense lawyer for Tru Tu Trin also presented arguments to try to reduce the sentence for his client. They might have cited factors such as old age, limited legal awareness, psychological pressure from family conflicts, and social prejudices. However, given the particularly serious nature of the case, the cruel act against an infant, and the calculated efforts to conceal the crime, these mitigating arguments seemed weak and unlikely to convince the trial panel or the attendees. During the debate phase, the representative of the procuracy maintained their prosecutorial stance, proposing the harshest sentence for Tru Tu Trin, commensurate with the nature and severity of the crime and the heartbreaking consequences the defendant had caused. Before the trial panel retired to deliberate, Tru Tu Trin was given the final word. She stood up, trembling. No more evasive words, no more blaming her circumstances. Instead, there was a frighteningly long silence, followed by a few choked sobs, a few disjointed, awkward words of remorse that didn't form a complete sentence. Perhaps, by now, she truly felt the weight of her guilt and the sternness of the law. The courtroom atmosphere became incredibly tense as the trial panel announced they were retiring to deliberate. Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok held hands tightly, holding their breath, waiting for the final verdict. They hoped for a fair sentence, a fitting punishment for the one who took their daughter's life, so that their pain could be somewhat eased, and so that little Nyu's soul could rest in peace. Everyone in the courtroom turned their eyes towards the bench of the trial panel, waiting for the moment of justice. After a long period of deliberation and a tense silence that filled the courtroom, the trial panel finally returned. The presiding judge, with a solemn expression, stood up and began to read the verdict. Every word of the verdict rang out clearly, firmly, like a final affirmation of justice. Based on the entire case file, the evidence examined at the trial, the testimony of the defendant, the victim's family, and witnesses, as well as the results of the debate, the trial panel determined that the actions of the defendant, Tru Tu Trin, were particularly serious, having violated the right to life of another person, especially since the victim was a child, the defendant's own granddaughter. This act not only showed cruelty and a complete loss of humanity but also went against the fine traditional moral values of the nation, causing outrage and indignation in society. Considering the nature and extent of the crime, the aggravating and mitigating circumstances, the trial panel reached its final decision. Tru Tu Trin was found guilty of intentional murder. For this crime, and considering factors such as killing a child, killing a person she was obligated to care for and nurture, along with the sophisticated act of concealing the crime, the court sentenced Tru Tu Trin to the highest penalty, death. As soon as the sentence was announced, the courtroom erupted in conflicting emotions. Vong Tu Han burst into tears, tears of pain mixed with a fragile sense of relief that the killer had finally paid the price. Justice had been served for an NHI. Lu Wei Kwok stood motionless, his face vacant, his shoulders slumping. Although he knew his mother's crime was heinous, the death sentence was still too great a shock for him. Blood is thicker than water. No matter what, it's not easily severed. As for Tru Tu Trin, upon hearing the verdict, she seemed unable to stand. Her legs gave way, and if not for the support of the police officers escorting her, she might have collapsed. A desperate, blood-curdling scream escaped the guilty woman's throat. It was the cry of ultimate fear when facing death, the cry of a complete breakdown. But it was all too late. The verdict brought a close to a heartbreaking case, but the lessons it leaves behind remain just as valuable. The tragic story of the Lu family is a profound warning about the terrible consequences of patriarchal ideology. It shows how antiquated prejudices and the invisible pressure to have a son to carry on the family line can push people to acts devoid of reason and humanity. The case is also a lesson about domestic violence, about how silence and weakness can enable evil. If Lu Wei Kwok had been stronger, if those around them had paid more attention and spoken up sooner, perhaps this tragedy would not have befallen little in NHI. The indifference and apathy of the community can sometimes be a factor that nurtures the seeds of crime. The pain of those left behind, especially Vong Tu Han and Lu Wei Kwok, will be long-lasting and difficult to overcome. But hopefully, the strict sentence for Tru Tu Trin will somewhat soothe their emotional wounds and, more importantly, serve as a strong deterrent, helping to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The tears of an NHI, a tiny, innocent soul, were not shed in vain. They must serve as a constant reminder to each of us about love, about the responsibility to protect children, about the need to build a civilized, just society where every child, whether a boy or a girl, is respected, loved, and has the right to live a full life. That is the most painful, but also the most meaningful lesson this case leaves behind.